gentlemen, big welcome to Wentworth Woodhouse. The first time, certainly I've been to a lecture in the State Dining Room, and it's a fine setting for an evening's entertainment. Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Peter Collinge. He was awarded his PhD on businesswomen in Georgian, Derbyshire in 2015. He's the co-contributing editor of Providing for the Poor, 1750 to 1834, and most recently conducted postdoctoral research on the project Small Bills and Petty Finance, co-creating the history of the old poor law. He's published articles on 18th century businesswomen, the grocery trade, spas, health and tourism, workhouse gardens, and the 19th century publishing trade. That's quite a list of things to be able to talk about, Peter. And tonight, we're going to hear about the country house visiting in Georgian, England. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Peter Collinge.
Hey. Well, thank you very much. I've got quite a big voice. It'll continue at this level throughout, which, might please some people. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'm just managing your expectations from the start. And if you want to ask questions after that, then that's absolutely fine. I'd like to thank Wentworth Woodhouse Trust for inviting me to speak, and more particularly for all of you for turning up. It's brilliant. So, here we go. Now, in 1764, Horace Walpole's servants refused admittance to some visitors to Strawberry Hill, his Gothic creation in Twickenham. At 10:15 today, he wrote, I heard the bell ring at the gate. I inquired who it was. The Prince of Mecklenburg and de Witts had called to know if they could see the house. My servants told them I was in bed. But if they would like to call again in an hour, they might see it. I shuddered at this report, and would it have been the worst part? The Queen herself was behind in a coach. I am shocked to death and know not what to do. It will certainly be said that I refuse to let the Queen see my house. Initially, Horace Walpole encouraged visitors, but in 1769 declared, I am now so tired of it that I shudder when my bell rings. It is as bad as keeping an inn, and I am often tempted to deny its being shown if it would not be ill-natured to those that come and to my housekeeper. One of Walpole's bugbears was that the public tended to ignore his regulations designed to admit only one party per day, maximum of 4, no children, no pets, tickets in advance. In 1784, however, he confessed, I am so tormented to visitors to my house that 2 or 3 rooms are not shown to abridge their stay. If the visitors got the catalogue into their hands, I should never get them out. Walpole was not the only one who felt tormented by visitors. In 1811, at Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire, William Beckford declared, Blessed Abbey, save and defend me from such riffraff and riffraffery as this. Grow, you forests, raise yourselves, you walls, and make an everlasting barrier between me and them. Like all country house owners, Walpole and Beckford faced a dilemma. Offering hospitality to strangers, managing political and social interests, and enabling servants to supplement their incomes on the one hand, against a desire for privacy on the other. Yet, for those with wealth, leisure, and mobility, the 18th century increasingly witnessed the development of country houses like Chatsworth as attractions, and tourists expected owners to be accommodating. Indeed, that inveterate house visitor, the Honourable John Byng, later Viscount Torrington, thought no one should suffer his place to be visited, but with the intention of making those visitors happy. Estates like Blenheim, Stowe, Stourhead, Castle Howard, Chatsworth and Kedleston were well known for admitting visitors, conducting tours, producing catalogues and constructing inns. At Kedleston, Mrs. Garnett, the housekeeper, was renowned for her knowledge of the house's contents. James Boswell called her a most distinct articulator. The Reverend James Plumtree thought she was the most obliging and intelligent housekeeper he had ever encountered. Her portrait shows her holding a catalogue of the pictures. Other servants, however, were less well informed. In 1735, John Dodd concluded that it was customary for servants to be unacquainted with what they were showing. At Belvoir Castle in Rutland, John Byng was shown around by a housekeeper of a very drunken, dawdling appearance, who confused the portrait of the Duke of Buckingham with the villain Felton, finally confusing, therefore, the murdered with the murderer. When James Grant visited Haddon Hall in 1797, his guide, Thomas Haig, told him of the elopement of Dorothy Vernon and John Manners in the 1560s. And if you go on a guided tour of Haddon today, you will still be told the same story. The problem was that Haig's description was just complete invention. The long gallery, the door Dorothy exited, the steps she descended, the garden she traversed, and the bridge she crossed were all constructed after her death. Sometimes visitors adopted an air of presumption about access and conduct in a house. John Byng was irked by owners whose properties were well known to be open, but who failed to grant access or who changed arrangements at the last moment. At Roxton Abbey in Oxfordshire, he wrote, "Lord Guildford just arrived from London and denied us admittance. Very rude, this. Let him either forbid his place entirely, open it always, or else fix a day of admission. But for shame, don't refuse travellers who might have come 20 miles out of their way for the sight of the place." Lady Beauchamp Proctor visited Blicking Hall in Norfolk in 1772. "I believe we drove her ladyship from room to room, but that we couldn't help." Perhaps Beauchamp Proctor's insensitivity was occasioned by having waited for over an hour while another party was being shown around. Arthur Young, touring England to learn about its agriculture, also wanted to see country houses, but not necessarily their residents. At Wentworth Castle, he appreciated Lady Strafford's discreet withdrawal from her rooms. "I mention this," he said, "as an instance of general and undistinguished politeness, in striking contrast to that unpopular and affected dignity in which some great people think it proper to cloud their houses." Some visitors treated properties with utter disregard, and if you're a volunteer here, some of these things might sound a bit familiar. They opened cupboards and sat on doors. They sat on ancient furniture, jumped on tables, jabbed fingers and walking sticks at pictures, broke off bits of statuary, scrawled on walls, removed objects, and generally poked and prodded about. Understandably, owners responded with forbidding points of access, high walls and fences, warning signs, admission policies, tickets, guided tours, and in some cases, prosecutions. Some refused access altogether. Troublesome visitors to St Bernard's House, Edinburgh, prompted a very unconventional approach to deter uninvited guests. The owner, Walter Ross, had enclosed his grounds, but was much annoyed nightly by intruders. So he set man-traps and spring guns, advertising the fact in local newspapers. But this didn't seem to do any good at all because the intruders kept on coming. So that his next development was really quite imaginative. So he procured an old leg from the Royal Infirmary, dressed it up in a stocking, shoe and buckle, and clenched in the teeth of a trap. The town crier carried it through the streets of Edinburgh, exhibiting it aloft, proclaiming that it had been found at Ross's house. The town crier then offered to return the leg to its rightful owner. Information on country house visiting comes from travel guides, from journals, correspondence, and newspapers. Travel guides and published journals tend to praise in an excess of superlatives the scale and grandeur of exteriors, the lavishness of interiors, and the artworks on display. In 1772, Arthur Young described Wentworth Woodhouse in the following terms: "The palace of the Marquis of Rockingham is situated in the midst of a most beautiful country, and in a park that is one of the most exquisite spots in the world. Nothing in architecture can be finer than this. The portico is lightness itself. The projection is bold. Let me remark that the effect is, to my eye, a beauty." And of the interior, well, it contained a great many admirable good apartments, furnished with great elegance in velvets, damasks, etc., and gilt and carved ornaments. The grand hall is, beyond comparison, the finest room in England. The gallery is supported by 18 most noble Ionic fluted pillars, encrusted with a paste representing in the most, he gets the word most in quite a lot, in the most natural manner several marbles. Nothing can have a more beautiful effect than these pillars. The fact they weren't finished wasn't really relevant to him. Letter writers were more circumspect in their comments than writers of travel guides. Descriptions tended to be shorter, or they were absent altogether. And that's because for the majority who visited country houses in the 18th century, this was not unusual for them. So they only ever commented if there was something new to really comment on. For example, a new wing, new landscaping, a recent purchase, preferably rare and expensive, or if they thought the place lacked taste. Only then do we get really detailed descriptions. Horace Walpole, as we have seen, complained vociferously about visitors to Strawberry Hill, but he was a keen country house goer himself. He recounted his visit to Wentworth Woodhouse in a letter of 1766. "It starts well, but soon becomes critical. Imagine a most extensive and most beautiful," here we go again with the mosts, "modern front erected before Lord Strafford's old house. And this front almost blocked up with hills and everything unfinished around it, nay, within it. The great apartment, which is magnificent, is untouched. The chimney pieces lie in boxes unopened. The park is traversed by a common road between two high hedges. The bowling green behind the house contains no less than 4 obelisks and looks like a 9-pin alley. On a hill near you would think you saw the York Buildings Waterworks invited into the country." I think he's talking about the Hoover Stand here. He doesn't quite say what it is. "In the inhabited part of the house, the chimney pieces are like tombs, and that in the library is the figure of the Lord's grandfather, in a nightgown of plaster and gold. Amidst all this litter and bad taste, I adored the fine Van Dycks." Walpole visited Wentworth again in 1772. "Great hall, noble, with pillars of yellow scagliola, but not finished, nor any part of the great apartment, nor is there any taste in the house. James Stewart has given a design of one chimney piece, but very ugly." Provided tourists were judged to be of the right sort, it's generally assumed that admittance to country houses was routinely granted to those without an appointment. The carriage drive to admittance, however, was strewn with potential obstacles. Entry often depended upon how you and your entourage looked and were dressed, and whether servants thought that their efforts would be well remunerated. Staff appraised outfits, one's mode of transport. A carriage was better than a horse better than arriving on foot. Letters of introduction and calling cards were inspected. Arthur Young carried a letter of inspection to increase his chances of getting into Worksop Manor in Nottinghamshire. Without letters of introduction, however. In 1835, the German art scholar Dr. Gustav Wagen had only a very superficial view of Wentworth Woodhouse because the housekeeper had been given no instructions about admitting him. Arriving on horseback at Lyme Park in Cheshire in 1792, some of you might recognise it as Pemberley, John Byng's visit was spectacularly unsuccessful. On meeting the housekeeper, he asked, "Is there any family here?" "Yes, to be sure." "Mr. Lees?" "No." Byng then asked to see the house. "Indeed you can't. I should have enough to do then." Hoping to tempt with the prospect of a fee, he countered, "Pleasing business, surely, for a housekeeper. We never show it to those but we know." And that was the end of his visit. Byng's inability to gain access to Lyme coloured his view. A tasteless, wasteful grandeur, as dreary and ill-kept as possible. Road maps marking principal seats, such as Lowther Castle, which is just below this image of where Penrith is, were widely available at the time, but not knowing the way, being ill-informed, or not allowing sufficient time could all result in disappointment. In 1781, an anonymous writer recorded, "By going 3 miles to the left, we might have taken in Wentworth House, but we missed it because we hadn't been informed about this circumstance at Sheffield." In 1781, Lady Caroline Carlow viewed Thoresby Park, Clumber Park, Welbeck Abbey and Worksop Manor in Nottinghamshire, and Wentworth Woodhouse, Warncliffe and Wentworth Castle in quick succession. The result was that she was not always sure of what she had seen or where. "We were in such a hurry, we hardly saw any of them with comfort, as they all lie close together, and 4 is rather too many to see in one day." Those were the 4 in Nottinghamshire that she went to see all on the same day in 1781. I mean, you'll be hard pushed to do it now. As they all lay close together. So, at the Duke of Portland's, we only saw the gardens and the plantations, and the same, I think, at the Duke of Norfolk's. Lord Rockingham's came next, but could not stay long enough to see anything but the offices, because we had Warncliffe and Lord Strafford's to see that day. But our schemes were frustrated because the postilion did not know the way, by which it means it was near 6 o'clock when we arrived at the lodge. We proceeded to Wentworth Castle, but to our sorrow did not arrive until it was too late to gain admittance. So we agreed to give up Lord Strafford's altogether. The most unusual method of arrival at Wentworth Woodhouse in the Georgian era came in 1827. On the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, Charles Green, accompanied by a Mr. G, set out at 4:20 from the Castle Inn Yard in Stockport. Charles Green was an experienced balloonist. Between 1821 and 1852, he made 526 ascents. The journey from Stockport was his 72nd. The balloon rose with considerable rapidity into the air and took an easterly direction. After sailing for long about an hour, Mr. Green felt anxious to know what part of the country they were over and pulled the valve line. When the balloon gradually descended, passing through the clouds, the first thing they saw was Barnsley. A few miles behind them, Doncaster, 7 or 8 miles to their left, and Wentworth House and Park before them. Mr. Green now determined to descend as quickly as possible, and on approaching the earth, they saw men and women running over hedge and field, endeavouring to reach them. The balloonists then proceeded to the village of Wentworth, where they were met with every possible attention, particularly from Mr. Jackson of the Upper Farm and from the steward at Wentworth House. From the outset, some country houses gained almost universal praise. William Gilpin thought Kedleston a composition of elegance and grandeur. George Woodward thought it a magnificent building, which in point of elegance is one of the first modern houses in the kingdom. However, visitors could be disparaging about places as a sign that they agreed with the tastemakers or were themselves the tastemakers. Horace Walpole cast his critical eye over Kedleston. A fine park, a vast house with 4 wings, only 2 of which are yet built, and we're still waiting for the other 2, and magnificently finished and furnished, all designed by Adam, not strictly true, in the best taste, but too expensive for Lord Scarsdale's estate. The front is heavy, there being no windows, the wings like lesser houses, the corridors too full of windows, and a monstrous weight on the back. The middle of the house is composed of an oblong and octagon temples, neither finished. There are many and large pictures, but most copies are sadly repaired. Samuel Johnson also took exception to Kedleston. The hall is very stately, but the pillars take up too much room. Behind the hall is a circular saloon, useless and therefore ill-contrived. There seemed, on the whole, more cost than judgment. The marble hall was ill-lit and of no use but for dancing in, and the bedchambers indifferent. He concluded that Kedleston would do excellently for a town hall. He hadn't finished. The large room with pillars would do for the judges to sit in at the assizes, the circular room for a jury chamber, and the rooms above for prisoners. What's interesting about Kedleston is that actually it became the model for the governor's house in Madras, in India, which subsequent Lord Curzon became the Viceroy of India. So it sort of had its outcome in that sense. Johnson was not the only one who made the connection between country houses and public places of power and incarceration. In York, John Carr's female prison, assize and crown courts, with their porticos, balustrades, entablatures, recessed arches and symmetrical facades, could easily pass for country houses. Indeed, Carr incorporated many of these features in his country house designs, including his additions to Wentworth. And I think if you look at those 2 pictures, you can see that the wings of Wentworth, which he altered, they've got this very, very similar architectural features. Chatsworth in the 18th century was often deplored or given only a casual mention in guidebooks. The Honourable Sarah Murray's guide of 1799, and I've got good, I'm up to there. If the imagination be raised to seeing fine things at Chatsworth, disappointment must ensue. The building is heavy, the river spoiled, the fountains are children's spouts. The cascade, which cost so many thousands of pounds, is an affront to the understanding. And for the sight of these things, the housekeeper and gardener expected 5 shillings each. When noblemen have the goodness to permit their fine seats to be seen by travellers, what a pity it is they suffer them to pay their servants' wages. Tipping servants provoked vociferous complaints. Arthur Young called it a vile custom, but few writers openly criticised owners who permitted servants to charge fees. Instead, they directed their displeasure at servants. Walpole's always good for a bad quote, or quotes about saying bad things about places. Walpole thought Chatsworth's situation noble, but the Duke is making vast plantations and widening and raising the river and levelling a great deal of ground. However, the whole patchwork from different masters has a very bad effect. He thought the west front extremely beautiful, the south and east fronts less so, and the north front very ugly. In the hall and other chambers is much wretched painting to imitate marble. The gallery is low and small and ill-painted. Longleat, so far I've really concentrated on houses that are in the Midlands or North. Properties in the south didn't escape trouble either. So Longleat in Wiltshire did not escape censure either. Of his visit in September 1814, William Beckford, the one who'd said so many things about visitors at Fonthill Abbey, his house, went to see Longleat. Longleat is, indeed clean and comfortable, and as fine as a great house can be without that touch of good taste, the lack of which one notices at every step. But there is a succession of apartments, some of them approaching the palatial, noble and spacious, with commodious corridors and the bedrooms in the best economical style of the most up-to-date furnished lodgings. There are some miserable cabinets, a deal of daubs or pictures enough to make one spit, and only 2 pieces of china to envy. I've given the context of different houses and what people thought about them to put in the context of what it is for what people thought about Wentworth Woodhouse, which, like other places, did engender a mixed response. Like elsewhere, visitors were keen to know how much did it cost, how big are the rooms, what are the materials used, and what is the art that we can see. In 1768, the Cambridge magazine reported that Wentworth was built in the most, here we go again with most, here, built in the most elegant manner. It is inferior to few in Great Britain. It is situated on the side of a hill and commands a very extensive prospect over a rich and beautiful country. Arthur Young's praise went on for several pages. It's about 20 pages he talks about Wentworth. In respect of convenience, the connection of the apartments throughout the house is excellently contrived. Young then details the dimensions of every room, the ceilings and marble chimney pieces, and the pictures. And there is a repetition of elegant, beautiful, charming, exceeding, fine, rich, handsome, and nobly furnished. The layout that Young approved of, however, did not always help visitors. When the artist Thomas Sandby and John Carr visited Wentworth Woodhouse in 1774, they stayed overnight, but they got lost on their way to breakfast the following morning. It's probably not unusual. In 1771, the Universal magazine picked up on Arthur Young's description of Wentworth. The principal front extends in a line of upwards of 600 feet, forming a centre and 2 wings. Nothing in architecture can be finer than this. But the park and environments of Wentworth House are, if anything, more noble than the edifice itself. Magnificent woods, spreading waters, and elegant temples break upon the eye at every angle. But there is so great a variety in points of view that it is impossible to lead you on a regular tour of the whole without manifest confusion. A year later, Robert Sanders described Wentworth as the most magnificent, here we go again, the most magnificent seat of the Marquis of Rockingham, commanding one of the most delightful prospects in England. All parts of the building are executed in the same elegant taste. And if possible, the rooms, furniture, and decorations within are still more magnificent. The hall is one of the finest rooms in England. From the grandeur of its dimensions, the justness of its proportions, the taste of its decorations, and the beauty of its contents, Richard Warner thought the Marble Hall superlatively fine. Of the grounds, Richard Warner thought everything without the mansion is consistent with the magnificence within and the expense. The menagerie and stables are executed upon a princely scale. To enumerate and analyse the august and diversified views which are caught from particular points of view would exhaust my powers of description and fatigue your attention. And he then goes on for several pages trying to prove that he's not going to fatigue your attention. As we have seen with Walpole, not everyone praised Wentworth. And in a direct parallel to today, many tourists only saw a work in progress. Time and time again, the rooms are described as unfurnished, not yet fitted up, or unfinished. Richard Warner noted that the room containing Whistlejacket was not fitted up, before noting that the white marble chimney piece cost £700. William Gilpin thought Wentworth superb and an esteemed elegant pile, but concluded there seems to be a want of simplicity about it. The front appears to be broken into too many parts, and the inside encumbered. On the whole, I was not much pleased with anything I saw. On the 4th of July, 1778, Lady Louisa Stuart wrote to Lady Caroline Dawson, "We have been at Wentworth House this evening and dine tomorrow at Wentworth Castle. Wentworth House, upon the whole, disappointed me. I had so often heard it as one of the noblest houses in England that I did not think it answerable to that idea. I dare say it is one of the largest, and the front is most magnificent. Whether beautiful or not, I am no judge, but I thought it striking altogether. But for the inside, it really does not seem answerable. Except a very fine hall and 2 or 3 more rooms which are quite unfinished, I saw no fine spaces. The rooms on the ground floor are low and dark, and the furniture by no means magnificent. Worst of all is the situation. Should you think it possible that in this country of prospects, where one would think it required uncommon care to pick a spot without one, anybody could build so vast a house directly behind a huge hill? I saw no more of the place than what appeared from the road leading to the house, and that seemed very formal and old-fashioned." Louisa Stuart's description displays 2 attitudes common to the Georgians. A propensity to be disparaging about a place as a sign of good taste, and a dislike for anything that they thought was old-fashioned. Being considered old-fashioned largely explains why 18th century tourists didn't like Chatsworth, apart from the fact that most of the collection was not actually there. It was at their house in London. And at the same time that they also thought that Kedleston, because it was brand spanking new, was marvellous. When Louisa Stuart was writing, the east front of Wentworth was new, but apart from its length, was not really revolutionary in its development of a rusticated ground floor, double flight of stairs, portico, balustrade and statues. This led to MP Richard Sullivan's observation that Wentworth House, though large and of a fair appearance, has nothing above the common style to recommend it. And I think you can sort of understand that point of view if you think of Kedleston, which, looks quite similar to the front of Wentworth, or of Stourhead, or most particularly the long demolished Wanstead, which was in Epping Forest in Essex, which was built between 1715 and 1722. And all of those share many of the features that Wentworth Woodhouse actually displays. In 1795, Henry Scrine elaborated on this theme. The front is truly magnificent, being nearly a copy of Lord Tilney's celebrated seat in Epping Forest, by which he meant Wanstead. But the wings, which are very extensive, seem inadequate to the structure and deficient in taste. The whole also, both without and within, appears unfinished. Inside, Wentworth resembled other places too, though imitation was not necessarily frowned upon. This is not the Pillared Hall. This is Caesar's Hall at Kedleston, and they're almost identical. Visitors to Wentworth Woodhouse's showpiece occasions, which grew in magnificence and scale over time, could not fail to notice that they were about more than offering hospitality. They were exercises in power, patronage, and influence. At the annual distribution of money to the deserving poor on St. Thomas's Day, which is the 21st of December in 1828, the Sheffield Intelligencer reported that 2,800 women each received a sixpence. This was more than an act of charity. Gift giving was about drawing the local population into a vertical chain of obligation. And I think if we look at a couple of other events that took place in 18th century Wentworth, we can see this extension of power and patronage taking place. So, In January 1733, the Weekly Register reported on the birthday of the Honourable Master Wentworth. His lordship gave a most splendid entertainment to about 1,000 of his tenants and neighbours, who were all seated at 2 tables. There was vast plenty of provisions, including wines and other liquors, and 300 dozen of trenchers or large platters were made for the dinner. In 1751, when the Marquis of Rockingham came of age, a most extraordinary entertainment was provided at Wentworth House, which consisted of, amongst other things, it's not quite showing you there, so I'll make sure what it is, 110 dishes of roast beef, 70 pies, 53 dishes of mutton, 48 hams, 55 dishes of lamb, 70 dishes of veal, 40 dishes of chickens, 104 dishes of fish, and the liquor drank on the occasion were 13 hogsheads of ale, 20 hogsheads of strong beer, 8 hogsheads of punch, and 4 hogsheads of wine. There were, besides, 8 hogsheads of punch and 4 hogsheads of wine drunk the next, 8 hogsheads of strong beer drunk the next day, and 40 loads of wheat baked into bread and pies. And there were upwards of 10,000 guests, 3,000 of which were entertained in the house itself. After they had dined, the victuals, what remained, were carried out into booths in the grounds for the populace, who had strong beer and ale as much as they pleased. The most lavish entertainment occurred, however, on the 2nd of September 1789, when the Prince of Wales visited here at Wentworth House. And it was described, I know about this because actually they produced a souvenir booklet for the occasion. So, the most splendid and magnificent entertainment that was ever known in this part of England. Not less than 20,000 people were assembled before the front of the house. The Prince of Wales alighted from his horse amidst the huzzas of thousands and was received with great applause. The company then had dinner and then went to retire and to dress for the ball, which opened at 10:30 at night. In the marble hall, the fireplaces were hidden by a profusion of flowering shrubs shaped into pyramidal forms. From the ceiling hung a chandelier, I notice there isn't one now, which contained 200 very large candles. Around the lower edge of the gallery hung 3 rows of various coloured lamps. Under the gallery, they hung in loops. On the marble pillars, they were all white, and festoons of different coloured ones connected the pillars around the room. When they're talking about these lamps, they're actually talking about candles. The whole number of these small lamps were 8,250. I can't imagine how much heat was generated by 8,250 candles, let alone the thousands of guests who were there. The supper consisted of sweetmeats, raspberries, strawberries, plums, nectarines in fluted oval jelly figures, real wild boar, potted venison, swans, and every rarity money could purchase, fancy, or conceive. They were all served up on silver plates, apart from those things on the side tables, which were all on gold plates. After supper, the company returned to the ballroom and departed at 6 o'clock in the morning, although there was probably a bit of a traffic jam. It is supposed there were about 300 carriages at Wentworth House. The servants and potboys were all entertained with a good, substantial cold collation in the riding house, and, much to the credit of so numerous a company of servants, the utmost regularity and order was preserved. The populace in the park were regaled with 60 hogsheads of ale. Numbers of stout, able-bodied men were, by its potent influence, brought low. We are sorry to relate that one of the wagons loaded with ale was set a-going down the hill, and a man endeavouring to stop it was run over and died the next morning. Another had an arm broken, and a third a foot terribly crushed. So, What I've done with this talk is to introduce you to different places that people went to, some of their reasons for going, but also the different responses that we actually learn about from these things. I might have given the impression that by the start of the 19th century, country house tourism was rampant, but we should be very careful about making this assumption, because most of the evidence that we have comes from a very privileged few. People like John Byng, Sarah Murray, Lady Dawson, Lady Carlo, and even Horace Walpole, who actually had a title as the Earl of Orford, were all from very, very elite circles. Most houses did not open on Sundays, and therefore they excluded the labouring population for whom it was their only day off. Visitor numbers are really difficult to work out. The most frequently cited, and it's because they're the only ones we actually have, are the 2,324 people who went to see Wilton House in Wiltshire in 1775, and the 300 or so people who went to see Strawberry Hill every year between 1784 and 1797. So if somewhere in Wentworth's archives there is any indication of how many people actually came in the 18th century, you're onto an absolute winner, because every single historian about country houses will want to know what that actually is. Only around 24 properties produced printed catalogues or descriptions of their houses. Just like today, the Georgians had different reasons for visiting country houses. How tourists perceived Wentworth Woodhouse and other properties depended on class, gender, and on the number of houses they'd actually already seen. Whatever their motives, everybody cast a critical eye over what they encountered, and compared it with what they already knew. And I leave you with this comment in 1799 from Sarah Murray, and she expressed a view which I don't think is restricted to the 18th century country house visitor. And her view, I think, is a reminder that for country houses to prosper, they have to really plug what are their unique selling points. So this is what she said: "My search was not for what is to be seen in the interior of fine houses, for when one has seen half a dozen, they are, in a manner, all the same." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I've been sat at the back of this room with a beam on my face all the way through. That was so entertaining. Thank you. I wonder, have we got any questions from the floor? If you'd like to put your hand up, we can take a few questions. I need to run with my microphone. If you could ask your question into the microphone, please.
Yeah, you said a lot about the different views about Wentworth, but one of the common comments was that it wasn't finished.
Yes.
So what was that about? How long was it not finished for, and why wasn't it finished?
Look at the size of it. I think most of these houses, we tend to sort of say, oh, this house was started in whatever year. For example, Kedleston started about 1759, and therefore it was finished in a couple of years. But actually, most of them took years and years and years to build. I mean, you think of the size of these things, then you think of the decorations of them, and then you think about trying to fill them. It's no wonder that most people saw these places in an unfinished state. And I think the other thing that you have to think about is that for a lot of the year, these places were not occupied by the family. The family was up in town, up in London. And therefore, if they were spending a lot of time in London, quite some of their best furniture and best pictures, certainly as it happened at Chatsworth, were taken with them to their country, to their London houses. And then you've also got to think about, actually, some of these people owned more than one house. And so to actually keep them all filled and keep them all stocked and serviced and all that stuff was really very, very difficult. And I really think we sort of imagine that these places as complete, that they just sort of sprang up and were finished, but they didn't. They took years and years and years to do. I know, for example, that Kedleston, and I know it's because I happen to live quite near it, it started in 1759, but they didn't actually do the fluting on the columns until the 19th century. And I think the floor in the marble hall here wasn't put in until the 19th century. Somebody's going to shout at me and tell me I'm wrong on that. Yeah, and occasionally places were updated. When they were thought they were out of fashion or whatever, or they wanted something new. This is what they had to do. I mean, imagine how long it took to create the lake at Blenheim. It's 13 acres, and it was dug by hand. So it's not surprising that people saw these places as unfinished. Okay, is that all right?
Another question?
Was Walpole's generally, frequently negative views, was it down to political alignment? Was it personal taste? In other words, he had a specific taste, and anything that didn't align with that was negative? Or was it just Walpole being Walpole?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. Walpole's correspondence is online, all 48 volumes of it. I mean, it's astonishingly extensive, and he mixed in the grandest circles. And yes, he loved his Gothic creation, and he liked Gothic places, but he was very critical about other people's attempts at Gothic. So it isn't just that he liked Gothic and nothing else. It's the fact that he liked his Gothic, and everybody else was just sort of imitating it and really not doing it very well. He didn't like places that he found to be old-fashioned, which is partly why he doesn't really like parts of Chatsworth that much. He does, however, he's so changeable, however, that he would go to a place again and he will give a different view about a place that he condemned earlier on, or a place he liked earlier on he now condemns. So he's really, really good, because for whatever argument you want, you can find a good quote from Robert Walpole. So it's a combination of his political allegiances, his own taste, and his own very exalted sense of himself. He wrote his catalogue for Strawberry Hill for his own consumption. He really did not want it published at all. And he kept on updating it because he just kept on expanding his collections, and he wanted to know what he'd actually got, but he was terrified of the public getting hold of it.
Any more questions? One from the back.
Thank you. The descriptive phrases that you quote, where do they come from? Are they from private letters that you've got hold of, diaries, or are they publicly attributable?
Virtually all of those are now publicly available. So Walpole's letters... Sorry? Oh, at the time. John Byng's diary was not published until the 1930s, and he'd never intended it to be a public diary. Walpole's description of country seats was published at the time, so we get quite a lot from that. You get other writers who, I didn't mention it, but Anna Seward, the 6 volumes of her letters were published just after her death, so they actually appear in the very early 19th century. So there was quite a fashion for publishing people's letters once they died, or writing somebody's life and biography. So you get Boswell's Life of Johnson. So those are published at the time. You then get, at the end of the 19th century, a whole flurry of diaries and letters being published from aristocratic families. And most of those are now available online for free. So that's really handy that you can get them. Description, so the description of the Prince of Wales's visit here was published at the time. And again, you can find that online. So you get a combination of things, but what the internet has actually done has been brilliant for opening up access to documents that you could never, ever have got hold of, even 20 years ago. So it's a fantastic resource that you can actually use. You've just got to be a bit creative about where to look and the sorts of questions you might want to actually ask and terms that you put into the internet for it.
Any more questions? Yeah.
So my question's quite simplistic. Is there an equivalent measurement for a hogshead?
Yes. If I go back onto here, there are... a hogshead of ale was 54 gallons, but a hogshead of wine was 63 gallons. They were not consistent, okay? So, you know, when you've got 20 hogsheads of strong beer, that's 20 times 54 gallons. No. Somebody later, there's a brilliant website called Forgotten British and Irish Weights, and it gives all the different variations that they've got, and you will see that there isn't necessarily a great deal of consistency. So different parts of the country had different quantities and different weights. So you get Winchester weights for certain things, and you get things for Yorkshire weights and all sorts of bits and pieces. And a load for wheat was huge variations across the country. But yeah, so these are the ones that I've got. So generally speaking, hogshead of ale, 54 gallons, but of wine, 63. Don't ask me why there was a difference there.
Just a question about why did none of the people writing make reference to the architects and art of the time and the comparative architecture? I mean, Lord Burlington was very influential, William Kent, and then back to Andrea Palladio and so forth. I mean, these were all interpretations of architecture at the time. And, you know, modern commentators would refer back to those periods and influences.
There are lots of descriptions of who was influencing what and who was designing what. And I didn't cover those because I really wanted to focus on not the ordinary people who visited country houses, but the people who went, when the majority of people I was talking about were people who didn't necessarily have a knowledge of architecture. So it was just their responses as to what they happened to see. I could have given an entirely different talk about what people thought about the architecture, because quite often they're quite critical. They sort of say, yes, but it's not really Palladian, is it? And it's not really, and James Payn could have done this, and Matthew Brettingham, well, he should have done that, and his influence was this, and what's the point of just copying that? When Samuel Johnson was very critical of the south front of Kettleston, that is a Robert Adam design at the back of the house, and it's designed, it was based on, off the top of my head, if I'm right, the Arch of Constantine in Rome. And it's really, really clear that it is there. So they were there, and the people were used to that. You could, of course, just buy the textbook, because a lot of architects published what were known as pattern books, and people just took their ideas from them. And it's sometimes very difficult to work out, unless it's a named architect, who give the name of an architect to a particular building if the accounts don't survive or correspondence doesn't survive. So, my favourite name of an 18th century pattern book writer was Batty Langley. So I quite like that one. So you do get these things, and they do write about them, and they do publish them, and they quite often just nick each other's ideas and just put a few embellishments on it.
Can I just ask about the artwork? Is there much comment in all these diaries and papers about the collections and how they varied by area or the type of house? And was it just the owner who decided what kind of collection they wanted and what type of art, or was it the kudos of the particular artist?
Okay.
Sorry, lots of questions.
Okay. The people who comment on them, so, like Arthur Young, who comments here, he literally goes room by room describing what's in them, and what he thinks about those things, and the particular artists that are associated with them. People who'd been on the Grand Tour, just hoovered up the art of Europe, and if they couldn't find the picture that they wanted, or the picture they wanted somebody else had bought, they ordered a copy. And they did not see any problem with actually having a copy of a famous work of art in their house. It's why you go to so many houses and you see goodness knows how many pictures of George III and they all look the same, because they're just copies after copy after copy. But they quite liked that idea. There were some attempts, when big art collections came on the market, to actually, people just bought the entire collection. They didn't necessarily want everything in it, but hey, they didn't want anybody else to have that collection either. So they would just go and buy the whole lot and then flog it. And then there were very specific art dealers. One of the things that William Hamilton did, as in who was Lady Hamilton and all that sort of stuff, with Nelson, he basically acted as an art dealer in Italy. And so would buy things and send people off. And then other people sent out things that they actually wanted. So, I want 10 Greek statues. I want 10 Roman statues. And they would go to the Florentine sculptors and say, have you got this statue? Yeah, it's missing a nose. Never mind, we'll carve a nose and we'll put a nose on it. Oh, it's missing a head. Yeah, we'll pop a head on it. And they would do this. And now we think, this is completely wrong. But for them, they wanted, I want a Roman statue. Alternatively, you could just order things basically out of catalogues. George Richardson produced a catalogue of ceilings, and you could just order it. So say, well, I like that ceiling. Well, I'll have that one then. Thank you very much. I'd like it with this motif on it. Fine, I'll just order it in plaster. So you could build up your art collection quite easily, either with real things or with fake things. And people tended not to mind so much unless they were sort of connoisseurs and so say, well, this is a copy. And they weren't being critical about it being a copy. They were just saying, this is a copy of the one which is there. It's what they liked. Okay.
You shared examples from across the Georgian period of house owners who opened their houses to the public. Is it possible to pinpoint who actually started the ball rolling? Who was one of the earliest exponents?
Not exactly. In effect, you really have to go back to the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, because the monasteries had been known for offering hospitality to strangers and visitors. And when they went, and when some of them got converted into country houses, people were still wanting to visit. There was also a belief that we want exclusivity in our house, but hey, there's no point just showing a house like this to people in our circle. So it had to be permeable enough that other people could get to see it who wouldn't normally get to see it. And what really changed country house visiting was nothing to do with the country houses themselves, but it was to do with road transport. When transport was incredibly difficult, it could take several days to get from one place to another. Having a stop off somewhere en route was very, very difficult. But once you get turnpike trusts coming along, which made access easier, then actually that opened up access to country houses. Some places like Stowe in Buckinghamshire were open very, very early in the 18th century. Wilton was open very early in Wiltshire. I don't know when visitors started coming here, but in a sense, it was just perfectly possible and perfectly acceptable for you just to turn up, even if there was no family there, because there would always be a servant on hand somewhere. If you think about Lizzie Bennet going to Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice, she doesn't make an appointment. There's no official opening schedule. People just turned up. What we do know is that places like Chatsworth and Kedleston, there were adverts in the local paper saying, it'll be open on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 11 till 3. Turn up then. So you do get some people beginning to advertise. But otherwise, it was just a question of, we're travelling through here. And if we happen to be related vaguely, possibly, and I've got maybe a letter here from somebody who says that I'm travelling, people would just turn up. So it's difficult to say exactly when it starts, but it had pretty much been going on for most of the 18th century. And even Celia Fiennes at the end of the 17th century was turning up at country houses and things. Right.
A couple of questions from the online audience. First one, you mentioned Lady Arabella Stuart. Was she a relative of the Stuart monarchs? And then the second one, I'll ask them both together. The second one was, were people visiting these houses to look at the contents and the architecture, or were they actually interested in the families that lived in them as well?
The first one is, I mentioned Lady Louisa Stuart.
Sorry.
Now, she was one of the 12 children of the Earl of Bute, who had a very, very short tenure as Prime Minister, but not entirely the shortest. And he was not very successful either, perhaps. And her sister was Lady Caroline Dawson, and they had another sister called Lady Jane Macartney, and she was married to Earl Macartney, and he was the first governor of Fort George in India, and he was the first ambassador to China, and he refused to kowtow to the emperor, and it created all sorts of trouble. So the Stuart family claimed descent from the Stuart family, and the Earls of Bute are still the Stuart family, and they're still round about. And the second question was, were visitors interested in family members? Yes and no. It depends on who the visitor was. Were they going to visit somebody in their network? In which case, yes, they were very interested because it was about patronage. What influence can I exert by going to see somebody? Or, what obligation will they owe me if they come to see me? Would be one way of looking at it. Other people were not so interested in families. They really didn't sort of that much care. They might want to know, we've been to so-and-so's thing, but in terms of being interested in the family, possibly not so much. That's a bit of a vague and waffly answer, but I think one of the things I said is that people went to country houses for different reasons. And so you sort of have to pick through the evidence of why somebody goes. John Byng went to places because they were old. He was one of the few people in the 18th century who really liked going to old places. And he condemned things that were new. He really did. He didn't like any red brick houses were out. He really didn't like those. The only exceptions about interest in families were if the place had had royal connections, yes, we're interested, or if they'd had a famous event taking place there, like an execution, that would be good. We quite like that. So any people falling downstairs and dying was quite a nice popular one to talk about. So yes, it depended on the nature of the family, the reason for the person going, and whether there were great historical or royal connections. They were popular for families going.
Marvellous, thank you. We've probably got time for one more question if anybody's got any burning issues they want to ask. Okay, well in that case, could you put your hands together for a huge thank you for Dr. Collinge and a magnificent lecture. Thank you so much.